Hello and welcome to another edition of Fortinet Live. I'm Rick Peters. I'm the CISO for Operational Technology for Fortinet covering North America. And today I'm fortunate to be joined by Derek Manky. He's Chief Security Insights and Global Threat Alliances Lead for FortinetLIVE. And today we're going to be talking about the threat landscape for operational technology, otherwise known as OT. We're really going to look forward. Obviously, a lot's occurred in 2021. But the good news is our FortiGuard has produced and actually responsible for a mid-November press release on the topic of threats, and there are some specific threads in that product and in the white paper that goes along with that's related. It really looks forward and gives you some big pause for thought, some issues that we want to talk about today. And so I'm really looking forward to this, Derek.
Yeah, likewise, Rick. It's always great to talk with you, and a lot of stuff to cover as always. There's never a break with what we observe, of course, through FortiGuard Labs and the threat landscape, and OT is certainly a huge target.
Yeah, we've experienced a lot of growth in what I would characterize not just as the attack surface, but the range of targets that represent operational technology and critical infrastructure, particularly over the last 2 years, but I think it even precedes that as a trend. But, Derek, FortiGuard Labs recently announced some thoughts and trends that we talked about and what to look out for in 2022. What are some of the highlights that you'd like to share with us? And if you can spend some light or shed specific thoughts on OT, I know that'll be useful to our audience.
Yeah, well, this is all connected, literally, Rick, when we talk about the threats here. So we have a couple of the trends that we highlighted in the trend report looking towards 2022, and basically the state of security that we see with that right now. First of all, if we look at the actual malware and platforms, right? If we look at a lot of these OT devices, they're running on Linux or flavors of Linux, different customized versions, kernels, and therein provides a lot of attack opportunities for attackers, and we're actually seeing them start to develop payload. So malware that's capable of running on these platforms beyond just a traditional, Windows-based botnets that we see and so forth. One of the things we highlighted in the report was Mirai as an example of being the number one botnet that we see in the IoT space. But really, if you look at the platform that it's running, we expect to see a lot more different payload being developed for that's going to impact OT technology, because this isn't just the embedded PLCs, program logic controls, that we talked about before, which of course are harder to infect. They're much more hardened and custom limited targets, right? So we're talking about a much wider attack surface. We're seeing the malware already being created for that, and then there's also the connectivity problem, right? I mean, one of the things we highlight in the report is going from the core to the edge to space, literally, right? We have this connected attack surface now, where we have integration from the cyber criminals, right? Looking at how they can hit these targets. It's not just the, in some of these critical infrastructure or remote field environments, Rick, where you have, a field engineer coming in and plugging in a RS-232 serial cable to one of these devices, because malware it's very tough for malware to do that. Now they're able to do this, with low Earth orbital satellites, LEOs, broadband satellite communications being available. It's just being much more connected now to a lot of these targets that were really off grid before.
It reminds me of something that's been true for a very long time. And I go back to my former life where we always recognized or thought about operational technology being a hard target.
Yeah.
So much has changed, right, in the last half to full decade. And we also recognize that the bad actors, whether it's organized crime, nation states that are sponsored, you name it, right, they're not bashful when it comes to parlaying tradecraft. And certainly one of the things that is common across all of the subsectors of operational technology is the dependence on hardware and software that can be decades old. So if we can think about that too, as we're talking about the threats, advancing threats and persistent threats, I think that's an important element, because I know today there's a sense of urgency. When I'm sitting in a boardroom and I'm talking to leaders, their sense of urgency has been primed. It's been primed by those who are on Capitol Hill, who have targeted specific market sectors, right, which have made headlines just in the last 12 to 18 months. So when you start talking about the electric grid, when you talk about oil and gas, water, wastewater, chemical manufacturing, these are industries that are on the pointy end of the spear right now. So what should those folks be thinking about as we think forward, not just about what we've experienced, but what we expect to see in the months and years to come?
Yeah, great points, Rick. So first of all, if we look at the state of security and what we see, like the actual attack surface itself, absolutely, a lot of these older platforms and systems are still in place. They are still a concern. That's that whole thing that we talk about, having patches up to date if they are available to a lot of these systems. And in fact, sometimes they're just legacy or end of life and not available. And we still do see attacks on that, and that's a concern. But thinking ahead forward, exactly what I was talking about, it's this perfect storm that's happening, right? Because you have this interconnectivity that's happening, everything that I just talked about, but you also have this convergence now of IT and OT technology. And so, we're just talking about the platforms like Linux and all these that are absolutely in the crosshairs and being now run on the modern OT sensors and all these different things that are being put out there. But you also have now IT systems that are running on Windows, running on these other platforms that are also connected. And that poses a big threat. We actually, we saw this in terms of ransomware attacks that happened this year, of course, where they weren't targeting OT environments directly, but targeting IT, and therefore leapfrogging or doing lateral movement into OT environments. But I think the message here is that will continue to happen. And so thinking forward, you absolutely have to think about, when you're convergent technology, you have these connected systems, how do you do segmentation? How do you do all the proper, security inspection between that, in terms of a mesh architecture
right,
and all that. But also at the same time, realize that what we're seeing, we call this out in the report, Rick, what we're seeing now is a shift to advanced persistent cybercrime, what we're calling. Right. So things like nation state and APT attacks that traditionally only target, critical infrastructure, I think that we're going to see more direct attacks on OT for all the reasons we just talked about, but also because cyber criminals are becoming much more skillful cyber criminals, so not nation state, right?
Sure.
Much more skillful, much more resource because of all the profits they've made, and able to directly attack those targets.
Well, it's a growing industry, and I know when I'm working with clients and executive leaders, they're naturally concerned about their ability to recognize any breach, right? They understand that they're a target, and they also understand the need for a proportional response, and they're looking at ways to invest smartly. They really want to be able to characterize what is their return on investment, because ultimately they got to go back to the stakeholders and say, this is the delta difference in taking this step. And so I'd like you to comment on that as well, because I think we have to have a way to translate all of this work into something that's measurable and can help to convince the executive leader that while they're not seeing events occur, that in fact there is a growing trend, and in fact we're able to neutralize those events instead of being something that we have to respond to or react to. We're out in front of them by being proactive.
Yeah, proactive is key on this, and I think every time we've looked at these situations, if we look in hindsight and reflect on a lot of the attacks that have occurred before, anytime we look in that, bar none, the upfront cost of investment in security, proactive incident response planning, all that sort of stuff that we always talk about in terms of security readiness is much less than the damage that occurs, which is much more than those attacks, right? Because again, typically, even not talking about OT, but in enterprise environments, the average cost of a data breach is sitting about $4 million US. In OT, that number can get much, much higher, because we start talking about manufacturing and supply chain concerns and all of that. And this is the reality, right? Cyber criminals, again, not the nation states we always talk about, but cyber crime sees this as attack opportunities. And so when it comes to translating this to risk from a cyber criminal's point of view, because they're realizing this, they're thinking they're going to hit you where it hurts, like what matters, right? What is your most valuable asset? And again, it's much different in enterprise versus OT, and the stakes and risk is much higher, I would say, in most cases with OT, because there is also that ripple effect. And so that is, when it comes to scenario planning and looking at that, it's really about identifying those assets, and those assets also being, of course, that supply chain, right? So it's those what if scenarios. How much is it going to cost if this production line goes down for 8 hours versus 2 days? And that really starts to put that risk in the spotlight. And again, like I said, anytime you start balancing those scales and looking at the investment and security up front, it's often much lower.
It's interesting. The operational technology leader traditionally has abstained from change. If it works, they want to stick with it. Yet, they're also realizing that it's time to raise the stakes. They have to protect their assets, whether they're soft or hard or both. And they've got to go beyond what they've done in traditional cybersecurity best practices. I mean, it's great. We work on visibility and segmentation, ways to neutralize and contain, but I think we need to go beyond that. Can you comment on the value of behavioral analysis as part of getting out in front as a countermeasure? Because I think the OT customer today is thinking about it, but they're just not convinced, or they're thinking it's a bridge too far.
No, absolutely. I think this is anytime we talk about behavioral analysis, and a lot of the capability to detect zero-day threats as well, Rick, is critical in this phase, because again, this is normally what's in the wheelhouse of the nation state actors. But again, what I was saying with the advanced persistent cybercrime is that whole capability, weaponization of advanced threats, persistent threats, and advanced meaning that they are absolutely focused on trying to evade security detection, intelligence, and controls. And the way that they do this is they have to make very clever malware, right? A lot of heavy obfuscation and things like that. And that's what we're seeing, is this sophisticated rise in the ransomware and the payloads that are targeting and affecting OT environments. And the only way that you can possibly start to prevent that proactively and detect that is not through old signature-based detection, but behavioral-based detection, and through very up-to-date real-time threat intelligence to be able to detect and all that stuff on the what we call the left-hand side of the attack. Because in reality, again, this is where cyber criminals are spending their time to weaponize new technologies, like I said, to evade all those controls. So you need that counter action, including AI and machine learning, that absolutely falls in there. And then also, keep in mind that they're spending a lot of the time on their reconnaissance too. That's the other aspect, right? Any sort of blueprint, of course, is worth its weight in gold to cyber criminals.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I'm thinking today, not only are the stakes high, but we need to go beyond a single source for the solution. One of the things that got me excited 4 years ago when I became a part of the OT practice at Fortinet was this idea of an ecosystem, really being able to correlate and build a technology alliance. And that's never been more important than today in 2021. But you read the language in the executive orders, and it's foot stomping the importance of sharing and partnership and intelligence sharing. And I can't help but think that Fortinet's in the right position to be able to influence that. Can you comment there?
Absolutely, and we are hands-on with this. I'm happy to say, Rick, we've been doing this for years also. If you look at, as an example, what we've done with in a community with the Cyber Threat Alliance, right? We were the original co-founder back in 2014. There was no OT sharing happening back then. In fact, I worked on the original bylaws. It was just Android malware and malware sample sharing. But now there are OT and critical infrastructure vendors, right? Part of research practices, part of that alliance. And absolutely, we share relevant details on that within the CTA itself. But going beyond that, we have also announced alliances one-on-one with some of these vendors too, because the more we understand and work together on the technology and share things like, targets that cyber criminals are going after, we can actually work strategically to harden those targets as well too. And I think that's a really critical piece. As you know, I'm very passionate about that, and I think it's crucial that we do that. We can't. I always say, when it comes to the war on cybercrime, we can't win this war alone. And it's the same thing why physical crime has existed for centuries, millennium.
Yes.
It's going to continue with cybercrime. So it really becomes a best effort of how we can work together.
Right. Hey, a final question for you, Derek, and it's something I took away from the white paper because I had a chance to really digest it. This theme of thinking beyond the present. I think it's so important. give you a chance to close and comment on that ideology, because I think it's foundational, but I read it throughout the piece.
Yeah. So the best way that we look at this with FortiGuard Labs is we're not just pulling rabbits out of the hat here, of course, right? We base this off of years, actually decades of experience, right? Looking at trends and what we've seen cyber criminals do before. The reality is that they have a full-blown business model of their own. They have a supply chain of their own, right? And so we track that. We really see on the dark web, as an example, what are they up to? What are they creating? Because a lot of these are alpha or beta versions of new technology they're creating before they're actually released. They always like to go after the low-hanging fruit, and that's the present. What's not the low-hanging fruit in the future that's coming up, right? And based on, and we oftentimes we see activity already that's starting to happen on that. The aggressive ransomware, as I talked about, we've seen just in the last month, I think a handful of new cases happening with that. And so this is something we've learned from experience again, and it's like the proverbial game of chess, right? We need to understand what's in their toolkit, what moves they can make, and think ahead of time for that so that we can have the relevant technologies and strategy in place for that.
Boy, spot on. This has been terrific. That we could talk for hours on this. Yeah. We're both passionate about it. But I wanted to say thanks for joining me today, Derek. It was a great opportunity to just sit down and chat about something that's important. And we realize how relevant this is today. And just want to say again, I really appreciate the time.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks.
For those of you who are interested, if we've spawned more interest on your part, I would encourage you to visit Fortinet's blog. You can easily access that and read a whole lot more, and be present and involved in understanding the stakes are high today. And as we move forward, we know we can accomplish a lot, not just in 2022, but even beyond. Thanks again today. And for Derek and I, this is Fortinet Live.
Thank you.